Good afternoon, everybody from around the state. My name is Teresa Chaklos, and I'm an AARP Massachusetts volunteer and part of their Speakers Bureau. I get to travel around the state to give presentations on a variety of key topics of interest to people aged 50 and older. Today, we will learn quite a bit about bees and how to support them in our backyards. For fun, please write in the chat where you're from and why this topic is of interest to you. We know that your brain health is very important to you, and with this webinar, we are providing the opportunity for exploration and learning something new. For great resources about brain health, go to AARP's Brain Health Resource Center at aarp.org/brainhealth. AARP maintains a deep focus on the health, financial security, and personal fulfillment of people aged 50 and over and their families. You will find this focus reflected in our offerings, resources, and in our advocacy. Right now, in every state and all the way to the United States Capitol, AARP is advocating for the issues that affect you the most. We are working to protect your hard-earned Medicare and Social Security benefits. And we're urging Congress to lower prescription drug prices, support family caregivers, and stop scams and shut down fraud. AARP is making a big difference. We are taking on Big Pharma and winning. Medicare is now able to negotiate for lower prices on some prescription drugs, and insulin copays are capped at $35 a month. We are also opposing any proposed cuts to Social Security. You've worked hard to save for retirement. It's your money, and you deserve to keep every cent of it. We'll keep working hard to protect your interests here in Massachusetts and across the country. We encourage you to bookmark the AARP Massachusetts state page, aarp.org/MA, where we post all of our events, our wins, and our calls to action. This will help you stay informed. Today's speaker is Bill Perkins. Bill is currently president of the Boston Area Beekeepers Association and leads their bee school each winter. Bill keeps around 15 beehives throughout the Boston area, mentors newer beekeepers, leads workshops, and tries to rehive bees making nests in attics, garages, and other places where they are not welcome. Bill also co-organizes the annual Urban Agriculture and Climate Fair with the trustees and leads workshops in maple sugaring, pruning, mushroom growing, and more. We were introduced to Bill by the Urban Farming Institute, an AARP community partner. You will hear that one of the hives that Bill maintains is right at the Urban Farming Institute. The Urban Farming Institute, or UFI, is a nonprofit urban farm located in Mattapan, Massachusetts. Their primary focus is to grow nutritious food for their community. They're also known for their farmer training program and various programs focused on health promotion. As a regenerative farm, UFI refrains from using pesticides, herbicides, tilling, and other techniques employed by conventional agriculture. They consider themselves lucky to support the healing of the land and those that grow on the land, including our pollinator friends. As you think of questions you want to ask Bill today, please place them in the Q&A section, and we will do our best to get as many of them as possible before the hour is up. After today, within 3 business days, a recording will be sent to you, and there will also be a brief survey that we hope you will take time to complete. Now, over to you, Bill.
Thank you, Teresa. It's so great to hear where everybody's from Boston or Merrimack or Peabody, Taunton, all over, Amherst even. In every one of those places, there's a beekeeping association where dozens, if not hundreds of people share ideas, have workshops together, and talk about honeybees. Um, and in Boston, you'll because we don't really represent a county, we more represent an urban area because of the nuances of keeping bees in an urban and dense suburban setting. We decided about 15 years ago that a Boston or an urban beekeeping association would serve better than a Suffolk County beekeeping association. So Merrimack, Barnstable, Norfolk, Worcester County, they all have beekeeping associations, and they're all fantastic. If you've ever been to the Topsfield Fair, you've seen the Essex County Beekeeping Association at work up there. And all of these associations, like ours, have lots of online resources. They provide mentoring, they teach schools, a bee school. Really, if you join that, if you want to keep honeybees, the best first thing you can do is join an association, and you will have no shortage of people who want to help you. So Boston Area Beekeeping Association included. We, in case anybody's interested, today's lecture is really on bees and not honeybees. And there is a distinction, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the Boston area beekeepers do focus on bees, a little bit on the native bees. And we, as the association, have two teaching apiaries, one at the Boston Nature Center run by Mass Audubon. It's in Mattapan, the Mattapan neighborhood of Boston. And there are about 14 beehives there and owned by somewhere up to 7 people. And we each take a turn all summer long on Saturday mornings at 10 o'clock to invite people in. And we hand everybody a jacket like you see those people in jackets in the upper left-hand corner of the screen there. And you can get as close to the hive as you want that the beekeeper is working on that particular morning. So keep that in mind. That happens right up through August, and young and old alike are invited. And then I keep bees at the Fenway Victory Garden as part of the Boston Teaching Apiaries system, and always happy to have people join me. So reach out if you want to join me if that's easier for you. But Mattapan's a great spot, beautiful location. So again, because I am a beekeeper and I work with honeybees, and I just love that that I can work with an animal. It's true, it is a livestock. It's really the only one that we are now legally allowed to keep in Boston as of about a month or 6 weeks ago. Before then, they were only legal in very small parts of the city, sort of the old part of Boston, and the newer parts of Boston, they were zoned out along with other livestock. But now bees are legal, and under certain conditions, we're allowed to keep them in our yards. So my prejudice, my focus is on bees, and I'll talk probably more about those than the native bees. But this is my clan here. This is Apis mellifera. It's the Western or European honeybee, and right there, that ought to sort of set off alarms because these are not native bees. The European honeybee came over, as best we can tell, in the early 1600s, and some of the earliest sort of landings of Europeans into the Americas, and quickly took flight, literally and figuratively. In fact, I don't know if it's true, but Native Americans considered that when they saw honeybees, they called them white man's flies, because they always sort of preceded the arrival of the settlers. So here you see a picture of a worker on the top, a queen in the middle, and a drone or a male on the bottom there. I can talk for days about bees, and I would be happy to give a beekeeping lecture at some point focused on bees, but again, that's not the topic of today. The blue in that picture of the global map is the native range, and there are many, many different varieties. because of these sort of ecological refugias. The bees were separated into certain areas and they would evolve a little bit. And then those areas would be combined again based on, glacial activity or climate or what have you. So we have different varieties of bees, but they are the Apis mellifera are all European honeybees. They can all mate with one another. All these varieties can. They're sort of like dogs. You have different sort of uh, classes or races of dogs. Same way you have with honeybees. Now, here's where we make our first distinction. So most of you probably know that bees are not wasps, but I do need to make that clear right now. So there are in this order Hymenoptera. There are ants and wasps and bees and actually something called a sawfly. I think I slipped a slide in here of those because they're so bizarre. But let's just clear the air now. Bees are the main difference between bees and wasps that I know of is that bees are vegetarian. The protein they gather, almost all of them, there is one called a vulture bee that uses fermented meat, but that's a bizarre example. But the honeybees and native bees collect nectar from flowers, and in doing so, they also gather pollen. And the pollen is packed with protein, and that's what bees use to raise their young. So there are insects. They have an egg. They start with an egg, and then there's a larvae, then there's a pupa, and then they emerge as an adult. If we were talking about butterflies, it would be egg, caterpillar, chrysalis, adult. It's those stages that are universal, um, and and um, and it's in the larval stage that insects will do most of their, if not all of their eating. I think all. There are always exceptions, especially when you're talking about, tens of thousands of different species of something. But typically it's the larval stage, whether it's a beetle grub or a fly maggot. Those are the stages that they're eating. And that's when the adults provide them the food. And in the case of bees, it's pollen and a little bit of honey, because honey is the energy, right? It's sort of the gasoline, so to speak, that we all need, whether it's a candy bar or some honey, or a bagel or something like that. But wasps, on the other hand, are meat eaters. They get they're carrion feeders, so they get their protein from other animal sources, whether it's a caterpillar or a bee that they've just chopped the head off of, or a piece of tuna fish sandwich that you're trying to enjoy in the fall around the picnic table. And they'll take that back, and instead of putting pollen and nectar in to the cell where the larvae is, they'll put a little bit of this meat substance. Sometimes the bees or wasps will actually sting it first, and then it sort of paralyzes this insect, whatever it is, and then it's alive, but it's not rotting. So it's sort of like natural refrigeration. Nature can be kind of cruel and gory sometimes, but it's beautiful in the way it works. But anyway, wasps get their protein that's so necessary for their young from meat sources, from animal sources, and bees get it from pollen. And you can see here the native bee in the upper left there and the one in the lower right, they're covered in pollen. Bees don't do it quite that way. And I'll talk about that in a sec. Here's a close-up of these scopa, they're called. The little hairs that surround the bee's body is statically charged, and the pollen just sticks right to it. So bees don't really do it that way, though. Yeah, this one is covered. She's beautiful, though. Oh, here's one of these sawflies. If you've ever seen this, I just saw it the other day. Didn't know what it was until I stumbled upon it. But these are Hymenoptera as well. It looks like a caterpillar, but it's actually related to ants and bees and wasps. Who would know? But fascinating the way they line up on these river birch leaves. But bees, again, these are my babies that I talk about so much. When they gather pollen, yes, some of it sticks to their scopa, but they sort of groom it off themselves and pack it in these pollen baskets, like you can see on her leg there. And those that sort of gooey amalgam of a little bit of nectar and pollen is what's packed into the cells back in the beehive and stored for when they're needed. They're not fed directly to the bees the way the native bees feed it directly to their young, which I will talk about in a little bit. But so bees, really, nobody paid much attention to all the native bees for millennia, for until fairly recently, really. They didn't really serve a economic benefit. Some people might have noticed that they were helping around in the garden by visiting different flowers, but for the most part, honeybees were really the most important bee of all. And and in this picture, sort of in the middle on the left there, of somebody, a cave painting of somebody collecting honey from cliffs in India from 8,000 years ago. And I think I have other drawings from 15,000 years ago. People have realized that honey is a wonderful source of sweetener, and there really isn't anything like it in nature. We figured out other ways of doing it now, of course, but honey was really the sweetener of choice. And you can see the person there on the bottom left with a big comb of what they call mad honey. They still harvest it by hanging off cliffs, very much like that person in the drawing in Nepal. And there are videos of that if you want to see something that will just absolutely blow your mind. And then but that was sort of harvesting wild or feral bees. But then nobody really knows for sure, but 1400s, 1500s, people started bringing bees into their agricultural sphere. And you can see in the upper left-hand picture there of some beekeepers from the Middle Ages with their skep hives. And I'm not sure those are technically skeps, but they have the same kind of design as that sort of uh, um, oval shaped hive, sort of like half a football resting on its middle. Um, and the reason why bees served people so well had nothing to do with pollination, which we'll talk about soon, which is really the key these days. But it's because of honey, like that gentleman has there, and brood, which is the term we use for the babies. So eggs, larvae, and pupa have a lot of protein in them, and people do consume them in some places. So you can take them and fry them, eat them raw. I have a friend from Trinidad who likes to take a bite every once in a while. Um, uh, so there's honey, there's the protein from the brood, which is rare, but if you need it, it's there. But I think the most important thing, especially in the Middle Ages and up until the time that we started whaling, the wax that was rendered from beehives was extremely valuable. Well, let me rephrase that. Light itself was extremely valuable. It would take days and days to earn enough money for the average person to purchase a single candle. So I think the reason why, if you look at some of the developments in beekeeping, a lot of them happen in abbeys and by monks and people who were in monastic settings, was because they were trying to they were trying to provide enough wax for the churches, for the candles for the churches. Um, so it was honey, yes, but it was a lot of the reason was because of wax. In the bottom there, in the middle, is something called propolis, which is bee glue. Some of you might remember it was in toothpaste for quite a while. It has a very good. It's a product that bees bring in and honeybees bring back to their hive and spread around the inside of their hive to to sterilize it. It's a great antimicrobial. Um, and but it's not used in toothpaste much anymore. I don't know why it sort of disappeared. But people still use it as an elixir. So today, honey is still collected, of course, and wax as well. But today it's really all about pollination. I mean, it's bees are kept by backyard beekeepers because of the joy that I get from it. But and I do keep a beehive at several uh, urban farms like the Urban Farming Institute for the purposes of pollination. But most of my hives are kept because I like working with bees, I like working with other people and teaching them about bees, and I enjoy the honey and also make some money from selling it. Um, these numbers are all over the place, but generally this gives you a sense of why they're so important. Um, uh, 80% of all flowering plants exist because of bees. The flowering plants that are visited by some pollinator or other, right? They're not all pollinated by bees, but the vast majority of them are. I don't know if the 1/3 of all food we eat depends on pollinators, but I do know that, well, there were various numbers thrown around, but in the US, apparently anywhere from 18 to 24 billion in fruits and vegetables exist because of bee pollination. Um, and it turns out to be about 130 fruits and nuts. Now compare that to honey. The value of honey in the United States is about 350 million per year. And and I'm sure that uh, well, those numbers certainly have changed from the Middle Ages, where honey was really the key, and wax, which probably is far less than 355 million. Um, so pollination is really the, the why honeybees are most important these days, and other bees as well. People are starting to use other bees as well. Bees are not the honeybees are not the only pollinators, and bees in general are not the only pollinators. There are animal pollinators, birds, butterflies. So there are multiple insects. Upper right-hand corner, that's a honeybee next to a hoverfly, which is an actual fly that looks like a bee. Reptiles and mammals, and there are all kinds of pollinators out there. Now, again, like I said before, in the long ago, when we were sort of at one with nature, um, there wasn't really a need for a honeybee as opposed to any of the native bees. They all sort of served their purpose. They all had a niche. Even uh, as subsistence farming came along, like in the lower left-hand picture there, um, bees helped in a garden situation like this, but really, uh, there were enough native pollinators around that if anybody kept bees, it was probably for the honey and the wax. And these days, even in smaller settings, smaller farms, like in the apple orchards of Harvard, Massachusetts, or Stowe, uh, or in some blueberry orchards scattered around the state, having a beehive might be helpful, but there are enough native pollinators around that it doesn't matter as much that you keep bees on your property. But in places like California and even in Southeast Massachusetts, where we have lots and lots of cranberry bugs sort of contiguous to one another in large areas, we have these monocultures that basically have redrawn the landscape in a way that has pushed out all the native or most of the native plants in that area. Yes, that's the definition of a monoculture, I suppose. And so these are almond orchards in California. if you put them all together, it would be an area the size of Rhode Island. And for about 10 days in February or March, beekeepers converge with their beehives, millions of hives, uh, into the almond orchards of California and set them down, and the bees go to work. Um, so just a little more about this picture here. So imagine you have a native bee, and native bees fly maybe a couple miles for their food sources. Hopefully less than that. Honeybees will fly up to 5 miles, but I think that's rare, probably, in places like deserts. Usually it's a mile or two. So in this picture here, if you have a native bee and it's, maybe on this riverine strip that's more native, more natural, right in the middle there, they might find a few flowers now and again. And then the almonds bloom and they have all the honey they need. If they're generalists, they have all the nectar they need. But if they're there are really two things here. One, if their lifespan is fairly long, like a honeybee, where they're sort of active all summer long, um, it's great for about 10 days. But then what do you do? Where's your food going to come from for the other, 350 days, you can't find enough food in that little strip of land there. And if you're a native bee and you emerge and in say May, and your lifespan is 6 weeks, you lay your egg and seal it up, and then you're dead, and your pupa survives until the next year. You're going to miss that nectar source completely. So it's a very sterile situation, and the only way in these monoculture orchards like this, and fields where pollination is needed, is to bring in uh, dozens, hundreds, thousands, sometimes millions of beehives. And they do that by loading them up on trucks and moving them from place to place. They'll load a few hundred onto a truck. They keep them in potato cellars all winter long up in Idaho, or they'll keep them down in Florida around the orange orchards, because they bloom pretty early down there. But once the almonds bloom, they're all headed towards the almonds. And then um, and they lift them off the truck in groups of 4, I think, on a pallet, and they lay them out and move them around the orchard, 4 per acre or something like that, or 1 per acre. And again, for 10 days, the bees drink almond nectar, which they really don't like. As a matter of fact, almond extract is a great bee repellent. And in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see a scene that might be familiar to some of you. That's a cranberry bog in southeast Massachusetts, and those beehives will be set around to help pollinate the cranberries. Also, a flower that they don't really like very much. So here's sort of the confluence of how the pollination, the pollinators, the for-profit pollination providers work the crops around the country. And New England plays a role. If we looked at that monoculture situation there, I think that's kind of what happened here. And I think there was a pesticide overdose or something in the neighborhood. They lost all their bees in this certain area of China, and they had to pollinate these, I think they're pear trees based on the flower, by hand. But I think that's since corrected, but I think it's happened in other places as well. So we don't want this. Yeah. So so to accommodate native pollinators, and again, we're not really talking about honeybees from now forward, a little bit, but you can have a beehive and you'll have pollinators, and that's pretty straightforward. And I'd love to talk about beekeeping and all the nuances of beekeeping and of honey beekeeping, and would gladly do so. And again, the Boston area beekeepers does offer a course that starts in February, I believe, 6-week course. But um, I think from here on, we're going to talk a little more about the native pollinators, which I always tell people, I mean, I love my bees, but I do worry more about the native pollinators because there's nobody sort of watching over them. And the stresses aren't getting aren't subsiding. They're only getting worse. There seems to be new stresses constantly. So to accommodate the native pollinators is to understand what they need. And like all living things, they need uh, food and water and a shelter. So we'll talk about each of those. And it's important to know their life cycle as well, because the honeybees, and why I have the picture there is because they're active all year. Um, and uh, and some of the wasps are also active year round as well. Most of them, I think. Um, and I should say that wasps can be a real pain because literally and figuratively, they are a little more likely to a little more short-tempered, shall we say. And it's also easy to stumble upon them because they nest in the ground sometimes, or they have a big nest in a bush, and you might be trying to trim the bush. So you get a rude surprise when you really don't want it. So um, knowing the life cycle allows you to sort of prepare for what the needs of the insect that you're trying to accommodate. In the case of bees, I have a locust tree here because trees actually do provide a huge source of nectar for bees. And trees are often overlooked when people talk about pollinator gardens, honeybees, that is. Other bees will gather nectar from locust trees as well, but honeybees gather as much as 50 or 60 pounds in 10 days and bring it back to the hive. Um, and so and the one on the bottom right is the sweet pepper bush, I think it's called, which is very common down in cranberry country. So having these plants around, and these flower at different times, and so knowing the life cycle of your insect and the flowering periods of your plants, they kind of go hand in hand. So shelter. With honeybees, we've been using these Langstroth beehives like the ones you see in the picture down below since the mid 1800s. They were invented here in Massachusetts, by the way. The trick was that Alphonse Langstroth, if that was his name, something like that, um, Lorenzo Langstroth, he noticed that bees like a space to move through. That's how they move efficiently through their nest. And that space he measured as 3/8 of an inch. So everything is sort of designed around that measurement. But for millions of years beforehand, they all lived in trees like this hollow tree trunk here that you see in the upper right. So for bees, we know what shelter they prefer, and it's works well for us and for them. Um, Helps us keep down diseases. I should mention now, because I don't think I have anywhere that I'm talking about it, but honeybees have, or you might have heard of colony collapse several years ago. Uh, and the bees are in trouble and all. And it's really true. I'm not sure what the cause of colony collapse was. There have been collapses over the centuries recorded, but basically I attribute it all to, and most people do, to the arrival of a very potent, very effective parasite called Varroa destructor, aptly named. And Varroa destructor is a mite, and it's if it were on us, it would be the size of a tea dish, right, about the size of your hand, and extended. And they ride around on their bodies and poke through their exoskeletons, and that creates an avenue for viruses and things like that. So as much as I would love to have just feral bees around living in trees. There are really not that many feral colonies anymore. They're usually first generation out of somebody else's beehive. And bees are best these days, their best chance of survival is with human intervention because humans created this problem. Humans have to kind of now babysit bees. I dare say if we stop doing that, honeybees would probably go extinct in the United States within 3 or 4 years because Varroa is so effective and the viruses that they vector. Native bees are doing okay. There are some that have gone extinct. Who knows how many went extinct when bees arrived, but they've been naturalized, honeybees, but now they're naturalized. But there are over 100 native bees in Massachusetts, and they are so adorable, as you can see from these pictures. There's the blue orchard bee in the upper left there, common. I believe they were common around here. Orchard bees are one of the more common bees that you see early in April. They are cavity nesters, and and they like the leaf cutters on the right side are cavity nesters, and like a lot of these native bees, they emerge. The orchard bee very emerges quite early because, as you might guess from the name, because orchards are usually blooming pretty early. They emerge, spend about 6 weeks mating, creating a nest, filling it, or finding a nest and filling it with eggs and food. And then they die after about 6 weeks, and that's it. And then the larvae emerges, the egg hatches, the larvae emerges, consumes the food that's left for them, and then pupates and waits for 10.5 months until next April. And I'm pretty sure that's the same for the leaf cutter, although I think that their period of activity is a little bit later. Again, why you want to have different flowers available at different times. The leaf cutter, as the name suggests, they cut these beautiful little rings out of leaves and use that to line their nests. I think we'll see other pictures of it, but you see in the bottom right there, a leaf cutter bringing a piece of leaf back, and they'll push it into that tube there. You can vaguely make out in the background, and line the nest, and then lay the egg and fill it and dump some food on top of it, and then they'll seal it and then do that again and again and again. Which they in nature they look for holes like these ones in the tree trunk there, with the arrows pointing to them. And if you were to break open one of those holes or follow it, you would see something like what you see in the top there, the leaf cutter at work. I'm not sure who that is in the middle, but those are pupa on the bottom. And yeah, I'm pretty sure those are pupa waiting for next year. And the bottom picture there, there are these mason or cavity nesters that gather flower petals instead of cutting leaves, and they use the flower petals to line their nest. It's just, nature is just so wonderful. Now I'm about to make your life a little more difficult if you have a garden, but something that I didn't even realize until a couple of years ago is that every time you cane your raspberries or your roses or what have you, you're creating a really good spot and a necessary spot. This is a good thing. You're creating this opportunity for a cavity nester to make a nest inside of it, because it's basically pithy and easily hollowed out. So as you can see in these 4 pictures here, these are native bees. Actually, that one in the upper right, that looks suspiciously wasp-like, but I'm pretty sure that there are no wasps that do this. And even if there are, again, wasps have serve their purpose in nature. But this is all to say that if you cane plants, flowers, raspberries, what have you, and you leave that little stalk, you're going to have nesters in there, so that if you were to cut them later in the summer or in the fall of the following year, you might be destroying the pupa that's inside there. So if you can, the longer you can leave those canes, the better, because they are providing a nesting source. But you can also, I mean, that, not also, that if you do remove those canes, you're probably removing a bee. You can almost always tell when there's one in there because you'll see the little hole. Um, so keep those. Regardless of those, you can also provide nesting sources, nesting locations for bees in one of a number of ways, but for the cavity nesters, it's pretty simple. You give them a hole that they can climb into. And for the orchard bees, the hole is just about big enough to put a pencil inside of. But for other bees that are cavity nesters throughout the year, they're going to want smaller holes typically. I don't know any that wants a bigger hole than a orchard bee. Um, and um, and that's why I like the looks of this one in the middle, although that's a labor of love, that's for sure. I've seen some that are even much bigger than this. But the beauty of that one is that you'll look and see all kinds of different sizes of holes too. So it's important. And same with that bottom right-hand picture there. Some of those tubes are unoccupied. Maybe they were already occupied and pushed open by the emerging bee earlier in the year. The tube that has mud on it looks to be much smaller. And again, that's probably later in the year, but who knows, speculation. But when they're done filling that tube, like that picture you saw earlier of them making those chambers, let's see, this one here in the top, each of those, I didn't really describe it, but each of the brown objects on the lower row of that top picture are pupa, my guess is. And the the first uh, the first egg is laid at the very back of that tube, and again, food and is dropped next to it or on top of it, and then that chamber is sealed with mud, typically, which is why they call them mason bees, because they gather earth to do their work. And they'll do it again and again and again and again until they get to the front. Incidentally, the bees that emerge first are males because they want to be out and ready for the females when they come out later to mate. Although they don't intermate, they're not from the same family, of course. That wouldn't serve evolution any good. And so, yeah, it's very easy to make these. I think it's probable that the bottom left-hand picture of that can with the tubes in it, those might be Phragmites sections, and Phragmites, as a lot of us know, it's everywhere. So if you wait until give it 6 months, those Phragmites stalks will harden up and provide great little tubes to nest in. But you can also use paper, you can roll it up, all kinds of different ways to create that. And then hang it on the side of your house. My only recommendation is that you would cover that with some kind of a mesh, maybe chicken wire or something, sort of bulging out from the front, because woodpeckers and flickers and things like that like to get in there and pull out those pupa. Another reason probably why the males are up front, because they're not, you can do without the males, 50% or 80% of your males. You do need some, but the females are the ones that are going to do all the work when they emerge. Then there's another class of native bees that are called ground nesters, right? I think there's a better term for that, but they include what we call the cellophane bees, because they sort of make a mucousy sort of covering for their cells, and the sweat bees, which are a bee that you might have noticed land on you at one point looking for salt, so apparently they call them sweat bees because they commonly land on people and try and drink their sweat. And that's a sweat bee on the upper left. You can see how tiny it is. I mean, the nesting hole for that little critter is probably pretty small. But they all dig into the ground, and the most suitable ground is kind of loose, somewhat sandy, but a ground that will, once dug into, will sort of retain its shape, will not cave in on itself. And something like 80% of all the native bees are ground nesters, and only about 20% are these cute little mason bees that I was talking about for 10 minutes or so, that you can easily make a nest for and put on the side of your house. These ones, making an area, sort of inviting these is a little more difficult, but best advice is to just leave a bare area of your lawn, like really bare, like even scraped, sort of like this one here. Um, and I know it's hard to see, but in the bottom right, you can see a blow up of the area here. You can see the little holes from these ground nesters. And again, these are not yellow jackets like you see on the lower right there. That's a nest, a yellow jacket nest. They do often nest in the ground, as many of you probably know from having stepped on the nest. They're very defensive. There are lots of them in there, and I'll leave it to you to decide how you want to deal with them. But again, they serve their purpose in nature, but if they're right next to your front door, you've got to do what you've got to do. These ground nesters are solitary bees. All of these bees are solitary bees. They don't nest, they don't congregate like yellow jackets or like honeybees. They make a single nest, fill it with their own eggs and the food that they've gathered, and they seal it up. And because of that, they're really not very aggressive. So it sometimes, to get one to sting you takes a fair amount of work, and usually it's not much more than a stinging nettle or something like that. So they don't like the wasps and stuff. They don't sting for defense. They don't sting to paralyze their food that they can bring back to the nest. I think the only reason they have stingers is maybe it might be some evolutionary holdover, but maybe it is for defense. I really don't know. So what do you do with the unwelcome tenants? Here's a carpenter bee going to work. Kara, I think, had a question about these ones. A carpenter bee, I call it a type of bumblebee, but I don't know that that's completely accurate. But they will drill into wood. Other bees will, they'll find their way into your home one way or the other. And honeybees often will do that too. The best is to, once uh, one of these, one of these woodcutter bees gets into the wood, they tunnel through and create a channel that's several inches long, and then they start to set up their nest the same way those cavity nesters did that we saw earlier, laying an egg and providing the food. So, if they're doing this on the bottom of your railing, that's not a great thing because your railing's going to get weaker and weaker. There are not many things you can do because it's all about the timing, and it just doesn't really work because either there's a bee laying an egg in there, or there's a pupa in there, or it's active at some point. So the best you can do is keep areas where they might be nesting painted. Almond extract that I mentioned earlier is a great preventative, great deterrent. And there are a couple of other tricks you can use as well. Um, Food, shelter. Well, we've talked about shelter. Water is important, and I wanted to get this out of the way because it's very quick. Bees of all kinds need water, and they'll come back to the same spot over and over again if they know the water is there. So providing them a little bird bath or something like that is great. The dirtier the water, the better, because dirty water has more minerals in it. The last thing you want is a bee floating around in your neighbor's pool. They are attracted to chlorine and bromine and stuff like that, again, because of the minerals, but provide them a water source. And if you want to attract them to the water source for the first time to get them to discover it, maybe put a little rim of honey around the edge of that water source, and you might get them, it will attract them faster. I don't have a lot to talk about food, but it's probably the most important one. Flowers are their food source, and luckily, uh, it's a one-stop shopping. They get their pollen, the protein, and they get their nectar right from the same source. So again, going back to what I was talking about earlier, the diversity of flowers, you want flowers that are going to be blooming all at different times all through the summer to provide to match the timing of the activity of the bee that might be active that for that particular time. So planting all of one flower is not going to help much. Diversity is important. Native is really important. I have some links to the Native Plant Trust at the end here. And then undisturbed habitat, of course. I mean, if you're thinking of adding on something or starting a project, just keep in mind the impact that any of that has. And we've covered a lot of the earth with our activity, and each time we go a little bit further, we're having more of an impact, a negative impact. And then also just keeping it, we're affecting the climate. And so keep an eye out or be aware of how often you uh, jump in the car or how hot you keep the house or how cool these days. These are
So,
things that I tell all beekeepers. A
so
lot of
Bill,
beekeepers don't have their beehives next to their house. They have to jump in a car and go somewhere.
So, Bill, we have a couple of questions for
Okay,
you. The first one is from Richard, and he's wondering, will bees inhabit or nest in hollow tubes, or do they need to make them hollow?
okay. Well, just quickly, Teresa, I am at the end, and here's a resource page for folks. So I think that's basically the end. Um, So if given a hollow tube in the right place, or a dozen or several dozen, uh, it shouldn't take long for the native bees to find the cavity nesters. If they're if you give them a pithy stalk, like the cutting, if you were to say take all the your deadheads from the raspberry cuttings that you make in February when you deadhead your raspberries, and you could probably make a several clusters of or bundles of the cuttings and put those somewhere. They are not hollow, but as far as I can tell, the bees will go to work and hollow them out because of the pictures that I showed earlier. None of the raspberries that I cane in February are still pithy and solid by the end of summer. They've got somebody inside of it that's dug their way in there. Yeah.
Okay, and Beverly wants to know, do bees hibernate in winter, or do they die off and new bees emerge in the spring?
Well, so honeybees stay very much alive all winter long, and it's the reason they collect honey. So much honey. They collect much more than they need for any given year. Um, Perhaps, probably, over millions of years, there have been catastrophes like volcanic eruptions that create snow that even in June and July in places like New England. So if a bee species that's active all year collects twice as much honey as they need, they're going to survive for a couple of years on the honey that they've stored. So I think that's why I think that they've evolved to collect so much. Now, all the other bees and wasps, as far as I know, um, not ants, but bees and wasps, they basically build their nests bigger and bigger and bigger. And you can see this if you notice a yellow jacket nest or a bald-faced hornet nest early in the spring. It starts with one queen who has overwintered from a nest the previous year in a mouse hole or in a basement, or sometimes I used to take kids out and we'd dig in the leaf litter in wintertime, and we'd always find yellow jacket queens that were sort of hibernating. Uh, they must have some kind of antifreeze in their system to keep them alive at lower temperatures, but they emerge in the spring, as do bumblebees and most of the other bees. And and they look for a new site, establish it, start to build it by themselves, and lay a few eggs, and then it's exponential growth from there going forward. So people that call me in the spring and they say, oh, the honeybees just landed on my house and could you come get them? It usually is honeybees because that's when honeybees want to create a new nest, create a new family, so to speak. But if I get calls in September or October and people say, oh, they're honeybees and the nest is in my house, it's almost always yellow jackets because it takes that long for them to be that noticeable. So, yeah.
And then Michelle is asking about when she had honeybees, they had a hand pump and they would put water in a container like a butter dish. And then her father had her put a piece of sponge in it so they wouldn't drown. Was
Mhm.
that okay to do?
Yeah, that's a good point because honeybees don't have a very good sense of depth perception or what have you. So yeah, I always, if I provide a water source, I always throw in some leaves or sticks or something for the bees to land on. Or if it's a bird bath, just fill it with some rocks in the middle and the bees will land on the rocks and walk down to the water. Just to back up a little bit on bees, the native bees, again, they're only active for about 6 weeks. The rest of the time, the egg that queen is laid, whether it's first thing in the spring from an orchard bee or a sweat bee in the middle of summer, the egg hatches, feeds on the food that was collected, and then within just weeks, it's pupating. And that pupa, her chrysalis, is very strong and survives for in sort of estivating, sort of not hibernating, but it's just a, a, a static state for the next 10 and a half months. So anyway,
And then there's a question from Ronald, mow or no mow? Can you discuss?
right. Well, actually, look at this here. I did do a little research on mowing, and when I typed in no mow May, this was the first thing that came up. And it's from the National Association of Landscape Professionals, and they say no mow May, not so fast. But they have their interests, and they suggest you not uh, stop mowing, that you keep mowing all the time. And their reasons are pretty specious, really. You can read it, but it's a good idea because yeah, you have all these spring flowers, and and if you mow them down, then you're just taking away the nectar source for the spring bees, like dandelions and things like that. I mean, if you can leave your garden looking like the bottom right-hand picture there, although it looks like there's a little purple loosestrife there, which is an invasive, but yeah, again, it's all about diversity. If you can make a diverse floral sort of timeline, then you're going to provide a lot of food sources for a lot of different species of bees. There is a link to Nomo May, folks. Whoops, I think it's the very last one. The Mass Audubon has a little talk about Nomo May. I notice I live on the edge of Southwest Corridor Park in Jamaica Plain, and they only mow every 2 weeks instead of every week now, and it gives the clover enough time to get to really bloom and to set up some nectar, or to send out some nectar. And I walk across there and I see a lot of honeybees now on the clover, whereas in years past I would see hardly any. There are more bees in the neighborhood than ever. Honeybees really, I see out there, and I think honeybees and clover go together. It's easier for them to gather nectar from them than most of the other native pollinators. But I do worry when they do mow. I think it probably kills a lot of bees. So I'm wondering how I might be able to research that.
Okay, so we are 1 minute away from 2 o'clock. I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. I certainly learned a lot about bees. You will receive a survey shortly after today, and we wish you would please take some time to complete that survey and send it back. And I hope everybody has a wonderful day, and hopefully, like me, you have a newfound respect for bees and concern that they stick around for a while. Thank you guys so much. And Bill, thank you so much.
Thank you, Teresa. It's been a pleasure.
You're
Always
welcome.
love to talk about bees. Thank you.
Take care, everyone.